So welcome, everyone. I'm Patricia Kranz, the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club, and we are delighted tonight to welcome John Maxwell Hamilton to discuss his book, Manipulating the Masses, Woodrow Wilson and the Birth of American Propaganda. And our beloved OPC past president, Allan Dodds Frank, is going to moderate the discussion. When it's time to ask questions, we ask that you do it in the chat function or the raise hand function. And then we will take your questions. But for 30 minutes or so, we will have a discussion between John and Allan. Okay, so Allan, I hand it over to you now.
Thank you very much, Patty. Great to see you all. We're really lucky to have Dr. John Maxwell Hamilton, we call him Jack around the Overseas Press Club, join us tonight to talk about his new book, which is a real academic labor of love. I can't imagine, but he'll tell us, I trust, how much work went into this, but I can tell you it was a lot. Anyway, as you may have deduced from the program announcement, he's really a Renaissance man who's still pursuing a distinguished, multifaceted career. As a newsman, he's reported from and traversed more than 4 countries. As an educator, he was the founding dean of the Manship School of Journalism at Louisiana State University. As an author, he's written a number of books, including one of particular interest to our membership, an authoritative book about foreign correspondence called Journalism's Roving Eye, A History of American News Gathering Abroad. He's been an OPC member since 2010, and Jack currently holds an endowed chair in journalism at Louisiana State and is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars and a senior associate at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, both of which are in Washington. Now, Dr. Hamilton's latest fascination is a deep dive into the events that occurred a century ago, which he believes reverberates today. Jack's investigation documents how the American government, under President Woodrow Wilson a century ago, laid the foundations for the government to build a propaganda machine designed to mislead the public. Using World War I as the rationale for establishing the Committee on Public Information, the Wilson administration in 1917 put together a propaganda playbook that foreshadowed what has gone on to varying degrees in subsequent administrations. In Hamilton's view, these perversions of truth represent a persistent threat to democracy. Now, Jack will help us enjoy his latest book, Manipulating the Masses, Woodrow Wilson and the Birth of American Propaganda. Dr. Hamilton, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Allan. I've enjoyed our association over many years, and I appreciate the chance to talk to the club. I'm going to get right into it because I want to cover a few points, and then I want to make sure there's plenty of time for questions. In my experience, the questions are the best part of this, but I think I ought to hit on several things. And I've changed my talk this evening a little bit from what I normally do, because I want to single out the role of journalists during the war, which is something I bring up in the book, which is not talked about very much. And I think I have something to say on that point about how journalists really gave up the franchise to a large extent in terms of what they should have done in terms of coverage. So I'm going to talk about the CPI, I'm going to talk about the book, and and talk about the journalists, and then I'm going to talk about the significance today, and then we'll get to questions. So there's to me a very revealing anecdote, and it was the 1917 Gridiron Dinner. The Committee on Public Information was created 1 week after we went to war in April 1917. It's our first and only propaganda ministry. Everything that we see today in presidential propaganda has its roots in what happened in World War I and Woodrow Wilson. And George Creel, who was a muckraking journalist who was the chairman, so-called chairman, but director of the CPI, the Committee on Public Information. And to give you a sense of how quickly he became influential in Washington, we can go to that Gridiron Dinner, where, of course, we all know Washington journalists roast Washington officials. The dinner, three of the skits actually dealt with Creel, who was at the head table sitting right next to Herbert Hoover. and who was the food czar, food conservation czar at the time. And one of the skits made a joke out of the fact of what was called the July Hoax, when the United States Navy was on its way to Europe and had a sort of encounter with the Germans, an uncertain encounter for which there was little evidence, but George Creel embroidered the story so much that it sounded like a huge attack in which the United States had fended it off and had been glorious, which quickly became untrue and led to this view that he was in charge. He had perpetrated the so-called July Hoax. There was also a joke about Creel being the censor, and that there was supposed to be no liquor in Washington at that point. Washington had prohibition in the district, even if it hadn't happened nationally. And they joked that Creel was the censor of a hip pocket flask he had with him. And then finally, there was a skit, a spoof with which 4 foreign high commissioners were briefed on the American government. Didn't the government have 3 branches? One of the commissioners asked. 4, their American interlocutor replied: the executive, the Congress, the judiciary, and the Committee on Public Information. When the dignitaries asked what the CPI did, they were told its job was to inculcate a proper respect for the administration. Right now, it's the whole cheese. I mean, it's all to the good. The main squeeze, the grand gazebo, the Lollapalooza. Understand? Well, this is a significant skit because today we use the word spin when we talk about what the government did. In World War I, the word was creeling, named after the commissioner, George Creel, the head of the CPI, George Creel. The CPI only existed for the time we were in the war, which is about 1.5 years. But in that short period of time, it managed to shoot propaganda through every capillary of the American blood system. It was a publishing conglomerate. It had pamphlets and news services, both in the United States and abroad. It had syndicated features, as well as not only news stories by some of the best writers in the country, but also it had cartoons that were syndicated. It had thousands of press releases. Before the CPI existed, press releases were a feature of government, but they were episodic. Now it was an unrelenting torrent. And they made the press release a standard of American governance. They had a division of pictorial publicity, which produced poster designs, cards, advertisements, seals, and buttons for 98 agencies and committees, the latter ranging from the Federation of Neighborhood Associations to the Salvation Army. It distributed tens of thousands of slides, propaganda slides, pictures taken by the military. It piggybacked on the motion picture industry, advertising associations, universities, and other professional bodies that gave it pathways into the American mind, into the American home. The Boy Scouts, traveling salesmen, and corporate titans did the CPI's bidding. Its advertisements were ubiquitous in newspapers and magazines. Families watched CPI films when they went to the theaters. And I want to stop there to just focus on one particular point because it's very revealing about the CPI, and that is the 4-minute men, an idea that Creel conceived of within 72 hours of getting the job. Some young man from Chicago came in and suggested it. And the idea was that somebody representing the CPI would stand up in movie theaters during the changing of theater, the films in the theaters, because in those days, the reels of film had to be changed. And they would speak for 4 minutes. And these men and some women became the 4-minute men. It's hard to imagine this, but there were 75,000 4-minute men by the end of the war, speaking in theaters, mostly in theaters, but at logging camps, in revival meetings, at county fairs. They were all over the United States. It was an enormous achievement, and they looked like they were local, and they were. They were local lawyers, local journalists, local judges, local bankers, but they were very, very, what's the word I want to use? But they were very orchestrated from Washington. And so they looked local, but they were doing exactly what the CPI wanted them to do every minute. The thing about the CPI's propaganda was that sometimes it was benign in the sense that it provided real information, and this was a real contribution. But it was also, even when it was benign, it was non-consensual. They used the taxpayer dollars to tell them things that they didn't necessarily ask to be told. And it was impossible to seal yourself off from this propaganda. You could choose not to pick up a newspaper with a CPI ad in it, and you could choose not to walk into a movie theater, but everybody saw CPI posters on streets. In fact, I found a wonderful little postcard in the CPI archives from William Johns, who was the chair of the CPI's Division of Advertising. He was driving near Denver, and he sent this postcard back, marveling at the ubiquity of the CPI's famous Red Cross poster, which had a Virgin Mary-like nurse on it. The poster, he said, was in the windows of towns on the prairies, towns as hardly as large as this postal card out in the flat, arid lands. That's how far-reaching the CPI was. I will stop on the background of the CPI with just one final point. In addition to it being non-consensual, there was censorship. They used coercion. They were tendentious. They used fear and appeal to emotion. There were front organizations that had no apparent attachment to the CPI, but in fact were mouthpieces for the CPI. And they were involved in disinformation, including one of the great disinformation scams of the 20th century. In fact, one of the first great ones. So,
Jack,
okay.
how did, tell us, this wasn't authorized by Congress. So how did this suddenly come to life, and how was it funded?
Well, it was funded out of, so the Secretary of the Navy, who was a journalist, Josephus Daniels, had a real need to manage censorship because the Navy was in charge of wireless and they therefore cable as well. So he had a real need to solve this problem. There were a lot of other people, including Walter Littman, I might add, who wanted to be propagandists and actually wanted to head such an agency, but Creel was very aggressive at getting this job and convinced Daniels that he was the man. He had written some very favorable articles about Daniels. And Daniels went to Wilson and said, we have to do something. And Wilson immediately said, this is fine, we'll hire Creel. Wilson paid him out of his war fund, which Congress had given him. So there was no accountability for the money. And in fact, that was a big problem and a big mistake in the end, because that Congress was mad anyway, because they saw it as a propaganda agency for Wilson himself. And because they had no control until the very end, they had no control at all. In the very final months, they got some control. But in that sense, it actually, if we look back on it, it was unconstitutional. There was no, Creel's appointment was done by Wilson without any congressional involvement. The budget was put together by Creel and Wilson without any congressional budget. And that's a bad way to run propaganda from a Democratic point of view. It's a good way for the president. Does that answer the question?
Yes. And this is the same guy whose family owned the Raleigh News and Observer for a long, long time, right?
Right. He was a very famous journalist and a big operative in the Democratic Party, right? And his family owned it, the paper until very recently. Absolutely.
Yeah, until the Knights Ritter chain bought it, I think.
Right.
So what surprised you the most while you were doing all this research?
Well, there's a lot that surprised me. I'll give you two quick ones. One is one I was going to mention in the conversation here. One was that I became very curious about Wilson's slogan in his 1916 campaign, which was, he kept us out of war. And it occurred to me that that may have been cynical on his part, because of course, as soon as he was inaugurated, inauguration in those days was in March, and a couple of weeks after being inaugurated, we went to war. I came to see that wasn't true, but what I did learn by going through all the records of the Democratic National Committee is that the Democratic National Committee's Publicity Bureau, which was the best publicity bureau in any campaign in the history of our country up to that time, because it was brilliantly and creatively run, was a test kitchen for what the CPI would be. And in fact, Creel was the number 2 person in that committee. Many of the techniques and many of the people who found themselves into the CPI came from the DNC. This is important not only because it tells you something about the history, but it reveals something very important about how presidents propagandize. We often talk about the fact that you campaign one way and you govern another, but in fact, or what you say when you campaign is not the same thing as what you do when you govern. But in fact, the way you campaign is very reflective of the way you govern. Start with Donald Trump. He tweeted his way in large part into the presidency and continued tweeting when he was there. Barack Obama used social media to get elected. And then as soon as he was in the White House, he creates a huge unit, bigger than the press office, for social media. John F. Kennedy was very good at television and used it effectively when he was president. So this is a pattern that we see all throughout the 20th century. The second thing that surprised me, and I'm thinking I may do a second book that deals just with this, is the extent to which the press became deeply involved with government during this period. In many cases, journalists just did this openly. And I'll give you a quote here from the head of the AP, who said, as soon as the United States went to war, he said, they had, the AP had observed very strictly neutrality on all controversial points due to the many points of view of its members. Today, thank God, this is not necessary. But now the contrary is true, for there will be no trace of neutrality coursing through our veins. Give you another example, which is one that I stumbled on, which is stunning, actually. The Columbia School of Journalism, in its second year of Pulitzer Prizes, gave one for a pamphlet that was written that called attention to the instruction that was provided to journalists during the present national emergency. And this pamphlet extolled the fact that journalists had publicized government programs and satisfied the unprecedented need for many specific concealments and for suppression of ill-timed sentiments. In other words, they got a Pulitzer Prize for not doing their job.
Wow.
That's something that would never be said today, of course, at all. So there was this obvious this obvious partisanship, but there's a whole nother level here. And that was that many journalists ended up working behind the scenes for the CPI, or for the Wilson administration. Many journalists actually worked, many journalists worked publicly for the CPI, and you knew they were journalists and you could see what they were doing in many cases. But there were many journalists who worked on propaganda, sometimes at the behest of the CPI, but out of sight. There's a hero in this story, somebody who's been completely forgotten and deserves to be remembered, a guy named Arthur Bullard, who was a fabulous journalist who died young and was went to Russia. He was an expert on Russia and had been there even in the 1905 revolution in Russia. Went to Russia, did some journalism, went to work for the CPI, and then wrote some propaganda that is the best propaganda I think I've ever read put out by the United States. It was honest. It was reflective about what was the shortcomings in the American experience, and it looked for ways to try to find common ground. He was eventually had to leave. The CPI was thrown out, and the great diplomat historian George Kennan said that his loss was the biggest loss of any loss they could have had in Russia at that time. The other person who worked behind the scenes and remained a journalist during that whole time, there's many, but I'm going to give you one, is Carl Ackerman. He's well remembered because he was a very, accomplished journalist, foreign correspondent at his time. But he went on to be the first dean of the Columbia School of Journalism when they got a dean in the 1920s. And I will just read you one quote from a letter to Colonel House. And this was before he was about to go to Switzerland. And he said, "My object is to be of service to you and the Department of State first." He went to countries where the Department of State and where House thought he could be most effective in doing propaganda. He worked undercover. When he worked for the Saturday Evening Post, the Saturday Evening Post knew he was doing this. And at one point, they wanted to actually install him permanently there, working with the embassy, the legation. And he was working for the New York Times at the time. The New York Times said it would be fine for him to pretend to be a New York Times reporter while he worked for the government. So you look at this, you say, really? How could this be? But it was a very pervasive mentality. We can go into why if you want to later. But we think of the CIA involvement with journalists during the Cold War as being that moment when a great deal of disillusionment set in, and the Vietnam War also set in a moment of disillusionment about journalism, but also a moment where the press became disillusioned with government. Well, I think the disillusioning moment, the first one, is really World War I, because after the war was over, many people who had been propagandists began to see that there was something wrong with what had happened, and it created a cynicism about government. And that cynicism was very pervasive. Here's a guy who's also forgotten. He won a Pulitzer Prize, actually, one of the first Pulitzer Prizes. His name was Ernest Poole, and he worked for the CPI. He was in charge of their foreign news operation. And he wrote a novel after the war called Blind, The Story of Our Times. And here's a quote from what he said: "Washington has been invaded by an army of ideas, a host of strange new aims and methods born in the clash and din abroad, and now entering here to bore and burrow their devices, the devious ways deep into our national institutions. We are being driven to drastic powers of control over the whole nation's life. And that was a CPI member who wrote that after the war. There were many more like him. And another one who is very famous and well remembered, of course, is Walter Littman. We don't remember that he wanted to be a propagandist and ended up actually being one with the American Expeditionary Force. But of course, then wrote a book called Public Opinion, and two others, as a matter of fact, in which he said it's no longer possible to believe in the original dogmas of democracy. So I'm going to go on to one other point. I'll make it very quick. We now have some laws that govern what presidents can do with information, but they're inadequate, almost meaningless in many cases. They're rarely applied. Of course, the reason they can't be applied is partly because the apparatus to apply them is under the aegis of the White House. Justice Department works with the White House. And so there's quite a lot of law. I can go into this quite a great deal of length, at length if you want. But the point I want to make is still remains a very real problem. And it's a particularly big problem today because technology, the techniques are the same as what the CPI did, but the technology gives the president and the White House much more power than it had. But in addition to that, the number of journalists covering Washington has decreased. So the balance of power has changed in a way that's very unwholesome, I think, for our nation. And people don't focus on this enough. And it's one of the reasons I wrote this book. There's a real story to tell here about how we need to fence back the power of chief executives to use our money to tell us what to think.
Jack, I want to do something I forgot to do, which is show everybody your book. Here it is. It's terrific. I want to go to something that you didn't really address about, you say that World War I was the birth of propaganda, American propaganda. And I wonder if you can tell us how different the newspaper business was, or the news business, say during the Civil War, because I know that Lincoln, I thought, was pretty good at commanding public opinion. And obviously you think that what happened in the Wilson era was completely different.
Well, so, every time, propaganda is an old idea. Every time a king puts on an urban robe and a bejeweled crown, they're doing propaganda. They're doing something to enlarge their office and give it authority. And you're right, Lincoln did have ways of gaining a foothold in public opinion. There's no question about that. And he did suspend habeas corpus, for example. And Stanton, who was one of his cabinet members, was very effective at actually using the press and controlling how the wires were used. So propaganda has two parts, right? One is the provision of information, and one is the suppression of information. You want to change what people think, you have to suppress some information, and you have to give them lots of the information you want them to have. And Lincoln did some of that. Teddy Roosevelt was very effective getting publicity. He was the first to really have, press releases. But when it comes to a systematic, pervasive propaganda, thought out, run by a large agency, the size, the scale, and the scope of their work dwarfs anything that ever came before it.
I must say that I'm glad you mentioned the 4 Minutemen, because I was just astonished as I read about the 4 Minutemen and this squadron of people dispersed all over the United States. But there were so many levels here, some of which you've already talked about. But for instance, tell us about just the cartoon division.
Right. So the Creel was very inventive and very, very energetic. And he was also a terrible manager. He was just utter chaos. I mean, staff members would have to beg to see him to get answers. He'd find a good idea one day and be off someplace else. When they did a post-mortem on the CPI, they actually couldn't figure out exactly how many divisions had been and what names were changed because the files were so messed up. But there was a group of people who were doing cartoons apart from the CPI, but they wanted a place to go where they could do it more systematically. So they came to the CPI, and the CPI took them in. There was a bureau of cartoons, reported directly to Creel, and they would some of the leading cartoonists in the country would put together cartoons, and then that related to war themes, and then the CPI would syndicate them, send them out all over the United States, and they could be used for free by newspapers. So it was just one of their arms. It was one of the easier ones to run. It was fairly simple. You know, you had pre-publication prints in newspaper cartoons, and you could just mail them out.
Now, I know over the years, various administrations in different countries have argued that it's the duty of the news business to unify a country, and therefore propaganda is completely justified to try to steer a nation into war, for instance. How does that idea fit with what you found?
Well, that's a huge problem, right? Because you don't want to have a newspaper that seems to be utterly unpatriotic. I mean, not only would you lose subscribers, but you would just not feel good about yourself as an American. But there are questions of degree. That's what I would say. For one thing, just publishing CPI press releases, which many papers did, instead of looking into them yourself, would be a good idea. And I think there are places where you can ask serious questions. And there were some that were asked. Airplane production, for example, had problems, and the press would glom on the road. But you know, because the president has such an overwhelming advantage in time of war, because it's a presumed national emergency, then you need to. It's easy for the president to bring the press along. But I'll give you one example of what I think is a very good example of what the press allowed itself to do and become complicit in. The war was an ocean away. There was no direct threat to us whatsoever. You know, there's a lot of debate about why we got in the war. And in fact, after the war was over, there were many people who thought that it was propagandists who got us in the war, British propagandists, which, by the way, is a part of my book that points out the extent to which the British used propaganda ahead of the war and how closely we worked with the British. So one way to make the war seem immediate was to suggest that there were spies everywhere who were trying to subvert the country. And in fact, Allan, if you don't mind, hold up the copy of the book again. The picture on the front is a picture by a guy named Joseph Pinnell, who was British but came to the United States, and he painted that picture. It's from a Liberty Loan poster, and it's a picture of the Statue of Liberty being bombed by German airplanes, and the whole of New York City being in flames, which was utterly preposterous concept. It wasn't going to happen, and so the press. The CPI not only had posters like that, but they also put out a whole. In fact, they even had a syndicated column called "Spies and Lies," and the argument was that spies were everywhere. And anytime you heard anything that seemed to be at odds with the administration's point of view, that was planted by spies, or you were engaged in spy talk. You know, today we talk about things like fake news, right? You want to fence back information that you don't like, you call it fake news. Well, in those days, they called it spy talk. There were a lot of stupid rumors that went around, and it was a good idea to refute those. But a lot of the things that were said as being spy talk were really quite interesting and important ideas, like maybe we should negotiate peace right away instead of fighting to the bitter end. And so we created this kind of hysteria about the Germans that wasn't deserved. And actually had very adverse consequences when the war was over, because now you wanted to go and get a just peace, but you vilified the Germans, made them into beasts like Huns. You suggested they were riddling the country and subverting the country. And by the way, German Americans were very abused during the war. And so as a result of that, when you go to the peace table, it's hard to have a public opinion behind you on a just peace when you've been telling them all along these people didn't deserve a just peace. It's worth pointing out that there was one spy who was caught during the entire war in the United States. One dummy who came across the border from Mexico to the United States with a terrible terribly fabricated passport. And his idea was he was going to start an industrial revolution. He was going to start a revolution of labor, a labor revolution in the United States. He got caught. He was found guilty. Only one. And I would add another point. You know, the first law that was used to suppress speech in this country was during the war was called the Espionage Act, named for spies. But there weren't a lot of spies in the United States once the war started. But that was used as an excuse for suppressing information.
Let me follow up with a question from chat.
I'm sorry, Alan. I want to finish that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's fine. So the point is, the press, instead of echoing this all the time and saying there were spies everywhere, they could have asked some questions, but they just took what the Justice Department told them and the Committee on Public Information told them and the State Department told them and just regurgitated it without any skepticism whatsoever.
That hasn't changed all that much.
That's one of my points.
Yeah. So here's a question from Jamie Floor Cruz. Fair to say that all governments, regimes seek good publicity and suppress bad press. When is propaganda and when is it fair publicity? How can journalists remain above propaganda, especially in times of war when the national interest is at stake?
Well, I think I gave one part of that answer, which is
right.
Not to just take everything the government tells you without scrutinizing it. And I think another part of that is to do independent reporting. Part of one of the things that happened in World War I, and it happens generally, is during a war there's so much to cover that you need help, and so you do turn to agencies and their press people. And so, you know, there are time limitations, but journalists need to be more independent when they ask questions, and they have to be willing to stand up. And we know in the Iraq War, which has now become infamous for the fact that journalists blocked the administration's point of view without seriously investigating charges of weapons of mass destruction. And as a result of that, they made it easier to go to war instead of being skeptical.
Now, one of the things that has changed a lot in the last 100 years is that there's no longer a robust, in the United States, ethnic nationality press. And you paint this rich landscape of German language papers, French papers, Spanish papers, etc. And I wonder if you could talk to us about how the propaganda committee worked in the United States through those papers, and then do the other half of the equation, how the governments in other countries differed in their propaganda approaches.
Right. So in a certain basic way, every country did propaganda, and every country did more or less the same thing. You know, the Germans came late to the idea of doing film. The British came faster. Film as a form of propaganda. The CPI, here's something that may be interesting to all of us. The British passed something called the Defense of the Realm Act, which is so strict that even today you can use the Defense of the Realm Act to keep from the public what the canteen at 10 Downing Street is serving for lunch. I mean, it's very all-encompassing. Woodrow Wilson actually wanted something that was this has actually never been written about. I was kind of surprised when I saw this. But what he proposed, something called a censorship. He wanted a censorship act or provision. It was called a censorship clause in the Espionage Act, which gave him all the power that the Defense of the Realm Act had. Even members of his own party wouldn't go that far. Although it's interesting to know that the New York Times, the New York World, the New York Evening Post, and the New York American all wrote to Wilson offering to do something that came very close to the Defense of the Realm Act. They said they would buy it, they would go for it in order to be patriotic. But Wilson wanted the whole thing; he didn't get it, and so we got what the Espionage Act had, which was still gave him plenty of power. So the point I guess I'm trying to make is every one of the countries had its own way of doing things. Ours was voluntary domestically. In Germany, it wasn't voluntary. Most of the war effort was run by the German military, and it was very repressive. And the French were the same way.
Okay.
I'll make a point. Every country called the other country, has said the other country had propagandists and said they didn't. And of course, that wasn't true at all. We mostly ended up copying the British in the sense that we tried to make it voluntary domestically. But I want to add something to that because it may not be complete. But we had a lot of other powers to suppress the press. We could hold newsprint back. If you wanted to use the mails, the post office wouldn't allow the mails to be used for certain publications that they didn't want to be published. And there was fear for, if you had books, you wanted to be able to sell your books abroad, but you couldn't sell your books under the Trading with the Enemy Act, believe it or not, even if you're just sending them to Britain, unless they were approved by a board, which the CPI was on. And so, and they would stop all kinds of books they didn't like. So you would effectively censor yourself at home. So there are lots of subtle censorships that took place that did have an impact. And because Creel was so over the top, he was very fiery and very intemperate. Editors were afraid of what he might do, because even the smallest thing that they would say that he didn't like, he'd some tiny newspaper in Duluth, and he'd bombard them with letters telling them they were unpatriotic. So that's that part of your question. The other part of your question was German Americans. The German Americans were controlled. First of all, the German Americans were by and large very patriotic. That's number one. Number two, in order to get mailing privileges, which is what they needed for German language newspapers, they had to go through the post office, which meant it became very onerous and they were worried about losing their postal privileges. So as a result, they censored themselves and went out of business. They had been the largest segment of foreign language publications in the United States. And at the end of the war, they had diminished to a very small number because they couldn't exist under the wartime conditions.
So Bill Holstein wants me to follow up and say, here's his question. FDR needed to get the media on his side to launch World War II, amid the day of infamy. Nixon had to create the idea that we had to defeat communism in Southeast Asia, and George W. Bush used weapons of mass destruction. What are the parallels with Woodrow Wilson?
Well, Wilson's argument for getting in the war was partly the provocations of the sinking of submarines by the Germans. They had suspended sinking of ships by German submarines. They had suspended that for a while in hopes that the United States wouldn't get in the war, but finally decided they were going to go ahead and do it anyway. Lusitania went down in the summer of 1916, but of course, starting in early 1970, they were back sinking commercial ships that were American ships. There was that provocation. There was a Zimmerman telegram, the famous Zimmerman telegram, which was intercepted and said that the foreign minister was Zimmerman, offered to the Mexican government that they should work together. And if the Mexicans would invade the United States, then they would be partners with Germany, which, by the way, is a good example of German propaganda, because everybody thought that had been intercepted by Americans, but it was actually intercepted by the British, who were listening in on our lines and then gave it to us, but didn't tell us where they got it. And the reason they had to listen, it's complicated. The reason they were listening into our lines is the British had cut off all communications for the Germans. So they had to go through the German embassy in Washington, D.C. to get to Mexico. And we were tapping the lines. It's a long story. But anyway, we were being surveilled by the British. And so there are those two kinds of provocations. But the second thing for the second set of issues was for Wilson. He thought of this as a progressive might, which was we're going to help cleanse the whole world through progressive reform. And the United States entry into the war would lead to outcomes like the League of Nations, in which the United States would take the lead in creating a new world order. And so his idea of going to war was one of doing a proactive good. That was his ideological impetus for doing this. It was then that was followed up with such bogus ideas as spies everywhere and all of that, which just helped reinforce the narrative of the insidious German.
Now, okay, here we go. We have a question from Marcos Kounalakis, who said, it's a rather long one. It says, what do you advise your students when reporting on corruption and criminality in open societies like the USA or Western Europe versus closed societies such as China? How do they achieve reporting depth, avoid moral equivalence, and properly contextualize their work? In other words, is being propagandized and excluded as a journalist within closed societies worse, better, or the same as in open societies? I think that's a couple of questions, but
Yeah, well, I congratulate him on having a really difficult question to answer. Obviously, it's a lot easier in the United States to go after corruption because we still most of the time operate on a rule of law, and we have lots of paper trails and collect a lot of documents, and the system works fairly well. But in other places where the powers that be have enormous control over the apparatus of government, it operates at the whim of political interests rather than rule of law. It's much harder. But it's an interesting question about. I'm just going to take a little different tact on this. In our own country, we're very concerned about rooting out corruption because it has to do with our own readers and our own people. We're interested in highlighting corruption overseas to the extent it's persuasive. If you're a foreign correspondent, you're mostly interested in showing and revealing what that society is like and how it operates. So in certain countries, we do a pretty good job today, I think, of showing how the Chinese government runs its country and the extent to which it's repressive and doesn't honor human rights. I think that story is told pretty well. Occasionally we get a case where somebody who has been a dissident, for example, is in the dock, and we can write about that story. But we don't generally go into another country and find out how their labor department is letting contracts, without bidding. I mean, that's not something our readers would care about. So we don't usually get to that level. It's more of a countrywide, cultural, socio-political, maybe that's even the wrong word, but it's more of a bird's eye view of what a country is doing rather than looking at some specific case, unless it's a political case, like I say, a dissident or somebody who's famous, Sakharov, for example. That's a story we would go after. I think this need for documents is somewhat different from domestic reporting and foreign reporting.
okay, so Bill Holstein has a sort of a follow-up on that. You've been a specialist on the role of foreign correspondents. How do you analyze the status of the networks of correspondence maintained by U.S. news organizations today versus previous periods?
There are some places that still do high quality reporting abroad. The New York Times is a good example. The Washington Post is doing a better job than they were a few years ago. They now have money and they're out being aggressive. Wall Street Journal does a good job. So that's a positive. Obviously, the boutique kinds of news services we had, the wonderful boutique services with the Baltimore Sun or Newsday or Boston Globe, Philadelphia Inquirer, those don't exist anymore. And that's too bad because they weren't as heavy hitting as maybe the New York Times, but they supplemented it. The AP is doing a good job. I think a lot of people in the AP are concerned about how good a job it is, whether they should be using as many foreign nationals as they should be, whether they should be sending more people abroad. There's some people who are concerned that at the AP, you have too many visual people in charge of coverage rather than print people. But I think on the print side, there are some places that still do a good job. I think on the television side, it's so depressing that I hate to say it's be publicly so publicly down. But CNN, I remember I used to be abroad. I'd watch CNN for foreign news coverage. I wouldn't watch CNN for foreign news coverage today, ever. I mean, they have a few people abroad who do a little work for them, but it's nothing like it was. And the networks just aren't what they were in terms of foreign coverage. Now, there is, though, another side to this, and that's the third part of this, which is there are relatively new organizations that do a pretty good job of covering foreign news. Bloomberg is an example. And readers who want to know about what's going on abroad can go to specialized services. They can go to BuzzFeed. You have foreign news. You can go and actually, if you're willing to root around a little bit, you can find some very good sites with some very good information that has real reporting, not just curated news. So there's some hope there. But of course, then the flip side of that is there's all kinds of bogus news that's being put out. The parades is real news and it's confusing, and you've got to be pretty astute to figure out how to manage it.
So I want to, here's another question from Jamie. How different or similar are the Voice of America and the other FRA and other tax-funded media now from their counterparts in the past? Is it fair to say they engage in propaganda, or they've been professionally legit? And
well, you know, so one of the things that the CPI did, some things that were very, very good. We all know the Federal Register today. They invented something called the Official Bulletin, which was effectively the precursor to the Federal Register. That was a very useful thing for the CPI to do because it enhanced government transparency. And one of the other things they did that was very effective is they created the forerunners of VOA and organizations like that. And they invented public diplomacy, which is a kind of propagandizing that I think, if done right, just like I talked about Arthur Bullard, can be very effective and very honest. But all the problems that plagued the public diplomacy effort and the precursor to VOA, the news service they had, for example, the CPI news service, exist today. Should it be a tool of policy, or should it exemplify American values by good, honest reporting? And where should it belong in the bureaucracy? There was a huge debate about, where it should be. The Committee on Public Information had these commissioners who went abroad, and the embassies didn't even want them. The embassies wanted nothing to do with this in most cases. And so they struggled to do their job. There were a few heroes there too, I might add. Some of what they did wasn't good. It was dishonest and manipulative, and some of it was very good. But there was never clear where it should be, who it should report to. There was a lot of chaos in places like St. Petersburg and in Bern, Switzerland, and Paris about people at cross purposes. They were inventing a way to do it, admittedly. But this was an accomplishment in the sense conceptually it was an idea. Well, those problems still exist today. Maybe because I'm a creature of my experience, I think that our news agencies ought to exemplify American values of honesty. I think the best way to be a good propagandist is to be honest and open. And I think it says a lot about our country to do that. So that's the side I'm on. But there are a lot of people on Capitol Hill who take a completely different approach and think all of those agencies should be propagandized.
So it's funny.
Or weaponized. I'm sorry, the word's weaponized is what I should say.
It's funny that you ended that way, because I was about to ask you to take us back to the original concept of truth and transparency as the basis for what the Committee on Public Information was doing. And so I want you to march through what happened and how did that get perverted and where are we today?
Well, one of the things that happens, there are certain iron laws of propaganda my iron laws. And one of the iron laws I mentioned to you, that you never do propaganda, only the enemy does it.
My favorite line in the book.
Huh?
My favorite line in the book.
When I went through the British archives, not the British Foreign Office archives, I spent a number of weeks there. I was stunned by the memos they were writing to each other. This wasn't for public consumption. This was for each other, saying, we don't do propaganda. Those Germans, they're doing a lot of propaganda. I can't believe what bad guys there are. We don't even know how to do it. And we would never do propaganda. And in fact, their propaganda was way more effective and way more insidious and secret than what the Germans did. But that's one iron law. And another iron law is that, and the CPI really exemplifies this, is that the power of propaganda is so great, and in certain times when it's administered, especially during a war, the cause seems so just that really good, decent people are easily tempted to shortcut the democratic process and just get the conclusions they want. CPI is a good example of this because it had intemperate people like Creel. He was the most intemperate. He may have been the most intemperate person in the United States. I mean, he was like a bomb exploding every 15 minutes. But the CPI had people in it who were very decent Americans, who were progressives, who were interested in reforms, who had invested much of their life in trying to better America and believed in democratic values. But as the war went on, they just said, the hell with it. You know, open debate is just too complicated. We just need to get people to think this thing. And so as a result of that, they were just easily tempted. And as time went on, the CPI became more tendentious and it became more inclined to use coercion and emotion. It's just the way it is. And an example of this in the CPI is a guy named Guy Stanton Ford, who was an educator, who was the dean of the graduate school at the University of Minnesota. He went on later to be the president of the University of Minnesota, and he ran the university program. And this may sound like hyperbole, but it's not. What the CPI did with universities, or to put it another way, what universities did with the CPI is a great embarrassment to the academic discipline. They basically suspended judgment. They policed themselves. They wrote the most egregious propaganda, the most tendentious propaganda. It's hard to believe that people who were well educated, and many of them educated in Germany, by the way, because that was the place to go to get a PhD because they were so advanced in evidence-based study, turned on the Germans in this way. And it's disgraceful. I mean, this is not just me saying this. This is well known that the universities basically threw up their hands and did whatever the government wanted. You go back to the Columbia University School of Journalism, they stopped all the classes in the spring of 1917, told the students they could just get their degree and all they should do is write propaganda.
Wow. So we have a couple more questions here. And then I want to get to one last thing about the big subject. But anyway, here's one from Patricia Krantz. Why do you say British propaganda was more insidious than German?
Well, it was more insidious because they were better at it. They took the view, the Germans tried, for example, the Germans did lots of propaganda in lots of places, but they were particularly interested in doing it in the United States. And so were the British. Because before we got into the war, they wanted, if you were Germans, they wanted us to remain neutral. And if we were British, they wanted us to join the war effort. And so the British had already put together plans before the war began in 1914 of how they would go about their work. The night they went to war, they sent a ship out into the ocean and took an axe and severed all the transatlantic cables for the Germans, all the oceanic cables for the Germans, which happened to run through the North Sea. That basically cut off their ability to use cable to get their information out to the rest of the world. The Germans still tried, but they sent very clumsy people to do it. And usually they were involved in crazy ideas of sabotage. Several of them were kicked out of the United States. This is before the war, mind you. And they tried to work with German American newspapers and German American communities, which were considered model communities because they were prosperous, worked hard, well educated, and had their own newspapers and got together at churches, social groups, and so forth. And those German American Americans, of course, were an important constituency, and so the Germans hoped to work through them to reach their congressmen. But the thing is, they did it in such a transparent way that it had a backlash, and it was seen, and they did it in a very clumsy way, where they were caught out and looked stupid. Whereas the British, they would operate secretly, and they would, for example, find newspapers they could plant stories about German spies in that didn't even exist. As I said, they tapped our cables and were able to find out what we were saying overseas, even if it was meant to be secret. They never told us, but they did. They decided not to do a full-on press in their propaganda, but to reach opinion leaders. And so there was an organization in Wellington House in Great Britain where they would write letters to influential Americans. I thought you'd want to know about this. I thought you'd want to know about that. So it looked like it was just kind of one friend to another. They sent them publications. And the result was that they were very effective at manipulating public opinion, and they manipulated Colonel House too, I might add, who was Wilson's You know,
Chief
Ray
of
Emmons.
staff, essentially, right?
Yeah, I mean,
So-
yeah, man without portfolio, but with any portfolio he wanted, he could touch it. And there was a guy named William Weissman who had been injured in the war and came to the United States, and he would help. On occasion, he helped Wilson write speeches, and he met with Wilson privately. And he was a British spy. I mean, his job was to come and do propaganda. Not he was a spy in a sense, but his job was to come and do propaganda. He was attached to the British government agency, but you know, ostensibly he was there for business purposes. But these people had very, very good ties into the executive branch.
Now, Jamie asked a question, because many countries like China and Russia assume that journalists are actually spies. How do journalists disabuse that notion when your research says many were, at least in the past?
Well, the first thing is how you report it. You know, if you report it with the headline says more spies caught, you know, that's different than saying more alleged spies caught. But it was done in a very sensational way. And it was more of, hey, look, they caught another one today, rather than a serious study of what people did. And oftentimes, the so-called spies were people who were just saying things that ran against government policy, which doesn't make you a spy.
So I have another question about a guy who, when I was at Forbes in the 1980s, the editor, Jim Michaels, who was a wily old veteran, if there ever was one, sent me to Boston to do a story about a guy, and I can't remember what was his 95th or 100th birthday, and it was Edward Bernays, who is often regarded as the father of PR. And so the question that we got is, how did his career at the committee shape his future as the leader of public relations in the United States? And I would also throw in Carl Bayer, who was like the head of the creator of public relations. Different kind of flackery, corporate representation, I guess.
Right. So Bayer was a boy wonderkind, and was brought in from Hearst and had great organizational ability and was very creative. He became kind of a factotum in the in the Creel administration, doing all kinds of different things. I'll come back to one of them in a minute. He was Mr. Fix-It, essentially. Bernays was very young, and he didn't have a senior role, although later on in life he'd like to embroider how big it had been. He had been, before he joined the CPI, he had been more or less a theater agent, a publicist for entertainment. And then he came to the CPI, and of course it became a more serious operation. He was responsible for overseas work, helping get businesses working abroad, to put signs up in windows in Buenos Aires and Bogota and Madrid. And he was creative and energetic. He was very energetic. And when he left the war, of course, then he's given the credit for inventing the term public relations. He and Bayer worked together. And when the war ended, he and Bayer actually created a little partnership and began to work, for example, representing countries like Lithuania, trying to help them get national recognition as a nation. But then they went their separate ways. But what they learned in the CPI, of course, helped them. And I'll give you one example. It's really quite an amazing example. It's called the third party technique. We use it all the time today, and Bayer used it with the CPI by creating front organizations for labor and different immigrant groups, German Americans and so forth. Germans, I think we call it Germans for Democracy or whatever. And these organizations, in some cases, people knew they were involved with the CPI. In some cases, it wasn't obvious at all. CPI would help fund them and give them instructions on what they were supposed to do. And Bayer specialized in this. He was very proud of it. Well, then when he became a PR man later on, he got himself in trouble. There were times when he was pushing patent medicine. There was times in the 1930s where he actually worked for the Nazis, believe it or not, helping them promote tourism in the early 1930s. And there was a case, and I can't remember for sure, I think it had to do with trucking, but where he set up an organization that was trying to, I think it was Truckers Over Railroads, but I may be wrong. And this third party organization looked like it was a grassroots organization that was representing these groups. But in fact, it was paid for by these groups, not representing them. It was a grassroots organization of kind of a think tank of good citizens. But in fact, Bayer had them funded by the trucking industry. And the railroads found out about it. And so there was a Federal Trade Commission suit about it. And then because it was considered unfair because it was dishonest. And it got to the Supreme Court, and Justice Frankfurter wrote an opinion in which he said it was odious what they did, but it was not unconstitutional. And of course, it happens all the time today.
Now, I think we have no more questions except this one, which I'm going to break my own rule of only asking one part question at a time and ask you a double jointed question. In my opinion, in the history of the United States, there's never been a more pervasive set of liars than the Trump administration. And I want you to address that, particularly in framing it with the big lie about the stolen election. But I'd like you to go back to one thing we haven't talked about that was a significant chapter in your book. And that was the one big lie with the fake documents from Sisson.
Right. So here's the story about the documents, and then I'll come to the Trump, but we'll make that the denouement here. They sent a guy named Edgar Sisson, who had no foreign experience and had been a muckraking journalist and editor. They sent him to Russia because they were very concerned that the Russians would get out of the war. On his way over, the Bolshevik Revolution took place. So by the time he arrived, the city was pretty much closed down and the Bolsheviks were in charge. His goal was to provide propaganda that would get the Russian people to stay in the war, which, by the way, was a stupid idea because it wasn't going to happen. The Russian people were sick of being in the war. The Bolsheviks had argued prior to taking power that they wanted to take the United States, or they want to take Russia out of this capitalist war. They want to make a separate peace. A separate peace was a big problem because Wilson didn't want a separate peace, and neither did the Allies. They wanted to really decimate the Central Powers. So anyway, while Sisson is there and he doesn't know what the hell he's doing and stirring up lots of trouble, trying to get the ambassador fired and other crazy things, some white Russians come to him with documents they claim show that the Bolsheviks are really just agents of the Germans. And they're going to take the Russia out of the war because they're just doing what the Germans want them to do because the Germans have funded them. So this has all the elements of what makes disinformation work. First of all, it's partly credible. The Germans had allowed Lenin to take the so-called sealed train. It wasn't really sealed, take the sealed train through Germany to get to Russia. And there were lots of rumors about the fact that the Germans were giving them money in hopes they would win the revolution. So Sisson, thinking he had this great muckraking scoop, takes these documents, there was almost 70 of them, which were utterly bogus. I mean, they had statements in them like instructions from the German government on whether Lenin should be elected in charge of the Communist Party in Russia, and all kinds of stuff like that. And he's very excited about this, and he comes back to the United States with these documents, and he wants them to be true, which of course is another element of disinformation, right? You really want something to be true so much, it matches what you think might be true, so therefore you like it more than something that would argue against what you want to be true. And he gives them to Creel and the State Department. And for some reason, and we don't know why, this was at the end of the spring he arrived in Washington, the pieces were not, the stories were not released. This was a very big thing for Sisson because he was determined to get these out. Kept working on them. And the State Department probably didn't want to do it not because they were sure they were bogus, because actually there were a lot of people in the State Department that thought they were true. But more than that, because they may have actually been looking for the right moment to put them out when they thought it could help tip the scales against the Allies, against the Germans as being perfidious. It may have been because they just forgot about it for a while and they didn't know quite what to do about it. It may have been because they were waiting for some more documents, but they didn't do anything with it. And so in mid-September, and we don't know how this happened either, Creel convinced Wilson to release the documents. And this decision, and the documents were sent out on a Friday. It was a 6-part series that started on Sunday and sent out to newspapers. The State Department wasn't informed that this had happened until Saturday, and they were very disturbed because they had a few diplomats left in Russia and they didn't want them to be harmed, which was a real possibility because these documents were very incendiary. And Secretary of State Lansing tried to stop the documents, but it's too late. They're already out. And Wilson didn't even talk to Lansing about it, which tells you something about his relationship with Lansing. What makes this, the fact these documents are bogus, which we now know, but we weren't certain of it until 30 years later. But now it was established conclusively by George Kennan in the 1950s. But we know that the documents, we've known for some time the documents were bogus. But what never has been written about is the extent to which the American press published these. Papers like the New York Times published them verbatim. They published exactly what the CPI set out on the front page. Many papers published every day. I had a graduate student go and look at 100 papers, a selection of 100 papers. We could not find one newspaper that wrote one editorial against calling into question the documents. I do know of one, it just didn't happen to be in that sample, and it was a New York Evening Post. And it did call them into question, and Creel went crazy. And of course some leftist publications did, and he didn't like that either. Then he decided, just because of that one paper, that he would bring in academics to study the papers. And the academics said they thought the documents were real, but they didn't think it showed that the Bolsheviks were German spies, that the Bolsheviks were doing what they were going to do because they had their own agenda, and that was their agenda. And but when Creel came in and said, you can't say that, they didn't say it. And one of a very famous Russian scholar said, we know we were under a lot of pressure from the government to be patriotic. And at a time like that, you just can't, you can't say everything you know. And so as a result, those documents became cemented into the public psyche at a time when the Red Scare was beginning to take place. And so now it wasn't just German spies, it was German Bolshevik spies, all of whom were in the United States, trying to subvert the United States. And it became a very important document in fueling the Red Scare of the 1918, 1919. It's a disgraceful episode, very revealing about the kind of things that happen today, of course. And it fits the narratives that we see with what happens with the Trump administration. And that is, the idea that you tell people things they think might be true and they would like to believe, even though there's no proof of it at all. And that's a tremendous power the president has, the ability to use the office and the trappings of the office for venal purposes. And of course, it's venal when Lyndon Johnson lies about the Tonkin Gulf, the assault on the Maddox and Tonkin Gulf, and doesn't put out, inflates what the occurrence to try to get us in the Vietnam War. Those things are terrible. But in the case of Trump administration, presidential lying is a bipartisan activity. But in the Trump administration, it reached a new level because usually, when you lie and you're caught, you're embarrassed. Trump administration, you just keep on lying, saying the same lies over again, which is pretty stunning.
Well, I'm going to wrap this up with one last question, and that is there anything we can do about it?
Yeah, I think there is. But it's I won't say it's easy. One of the reasons that we don't have good laws is because members of Congress, if they're in power, members of Congress are part of the president's party. They don't want to go after the president for abusing the privileges of the propaganda privileges of the office. And if you're not in power, nobody's going to do anything because you're not in power. But what we really need to do is investigate what our government does. We need to have stronger rules. We don't even have good rules about what a president can do and what they can't do. Our definition of propaganda in the rule books, in the law, is that propaganda is when the government hires somebody who pretends to be a journalist to write about a government agency. Well, that's not a good thing to do, but that's a very limited idea of what propaganda is. And so there are things we could do. We could actually, I know everybody always says these things, but I believe it's true. We could set up a blue ribbon panel to find out exactly, to do a study to find out exactly what the government's doing. We don't even know how much government information is put out every year. We don't even have a sense of this because a lot of it's taken for granted and a lot of it's done in ways we can't see. We need to find out, for one thing, what's happening. And then we need to find out ways to monitor it on a regular basis and call it out. And journalists have unfortunately, I think, missed an important part of the story. Journalists get angry because their FOI request isn't answered. I mean, that's what they want to go after, the FOI process. Why don't I get more of my specific requests answered? But I think what journalists ought to do is ask the question, what is the government doing with our tax dollars to influence what we think? It's not an easy thing to do. In some ways, not even sexy, because some of the things the government does do are very valuable to us. I mean, there's a paradox here. One of the great jewels of our democracy is the amount of really high quality information the government puts out. Scientific studies, alerts on pending hurricanes, publishing the proceedings of Congress, publishing the proceedings and opinions and proceedings in the State Department. And we put out lots and lots of wonderful data and information. And that's good. We ought to recognize that. But there are examples I can go through, though I won't right now. But there are cases where presidents use the power of their office to promote a president can get up and give a speech and say, I think we should lower the minimum wage, raise the minimum wage. That's fine. It's not fine for the Labor Department to put out information trying to urge Americans to lobby Congress to raise the minimum wage. Labor Department shouldn't do that. Presidents can argue for it, but we shouldn't use the apparatus of the government to try to propagandize our citizens to tell Congress to do something. I happen to think the minimum wage should be raised, but I'm, as a journalist, that's not my job. My job is to report what's going on. And we need to cover more of these transgressions. We need to make people think about what the government's doing that's undemocratic. And maybe Trump, he's obviously an outlier in many ways, but maybe he tells us to think about that. You know, when he says he won the election, he's sitting in the White House, a very dignified place. And what does he have play in the background? Hail to the chief. Biden can't play Hail to the Chief in the background when he's not elected, but Trump can. And he can put his name on coronavirus checks. And those are flagrant examples. And so that should give us cause to ask ourselves what's okay and what's not. And there are laws we could write, and they should be enforced.
It's a great note to end on. Here it is, Manipulating the Masses, Woodrow Wilson and the Birth of American Propaganda by Dr. John Maxwell Hamilton, the winner, I forgot to mention, of the 2021 Goldsmith Prize from the Shorenstein Institute on Media and Politics, etc., at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. And this is published by the LSU Press, and there's a link to the book on our chat right now if you'd like to look at it. Doctor, thank you again. It was really an informative, fascinating evening. And I did also love your sentence. Propaganda reverses the democracy idea that elected appointed officials answer to the people rather than it means people answer to the government.
Thank you for having me on, Alan. Thanks for the good
Thanks, it
question.
was great.
Thank you.
Thank you all, and we'll see you soon. Look for at the OPC Bulletin for the next program. Thanks a million.